So this is our last topic for tissue types. So the last one that we need to fit in that last little box that should still be empty on your piece of paper will be for connective tissue. Now, connective tissue is by far the most diverse type of tissue that we have. The easy way of thinking of it is that if it contracts, it's muscle. If it covers and lines stuff, it's epithelial. And if it sends electricity, it's nervous. And if it doesn't do one of those three things, it probably fits in the junk drawer that we call connective tissue. So there's an awful lot that we could put here, so I'm going to really boil it down to some essentials. So first of all, connective tissue connects. It's really that simple. So it can connect through something hard like bone, something more rope-like a tendon or a ligament, or something fluid like blood. Anything that's connecting different parts of the body is going to fall under connective tissue. One thing that we can say about connective tissue is that it has lots and lots of extracellular matrix. So, as I said before, hopefully you watched the crash course video, and you noticed that he talked about connective tissue being kind of like that jello with like the little suspended marshmallows and chunks of fruit in it. And those little suspended marshmallows and chunks of fruit, those are your cells, and the gelatin is actually the matrix surrounding those cells. So I'm going to break things up in slightly different categories than they did in the other video. So I like to break it up into three main categories. So we have connective tissue proper. So these are kind of like our ropes or burlap sack kind of sheets. So let's just hit some highlights here. We can have loose connective tissue. So these would be things like areolar, adipose, or reticular cartilage, or reticular tissue. Now, adipose is really good at storing fat, so this is going to be for kind of energy storage. Areolar tends to be a little bit more kind of string-like, has more fibers in it. Reticular tends to be pretty delicate. And then we can have dense connective tissue proper, and these are kind of my ropes or my sheets. So these would be things that are rope-like or sheets. So you can have tendons, which connect what? Connect bone to muscle. You can have ligaments, which are going to connect bone to bone. And then you can have something called an aponeuroses. It's supposed to be an S. Aponeuroses or fascia. And these are going to be kind of sheets of connective tissue. If you've ever gotten a rack of ribs from the store, you might have noticed there's kind of like a tough connective tissue sheet on the back side of it, which is actually really the kind of deep surface of that rib, and you have to sort of peel that off before you can cook the ribs. It's going to be really tough to cut through even with a good knife. Then we can have our fluid connective tissues. And this is going to include blood, which has lots of functions, but ultimately we can sum them all up as transport. And then we have lymph, which really was ECF, extracellular fluid, that flowed into your lymphatic vessels to be checked out by your immune system. Ultimately, lymph becomes plasma. So it will get dumped back into the circulatory system right before blood enters the heart. And then we can have our supportive connective tissue, which is going to include bone and different types of cartilage. Now, bone is going to obviously provide support. It helps to make blood, so it makes all types of blood cells. It helps to protect you. In particular, your skull is a little too good at its job sometimes. It provides leverage for muscles. And it helps us to store lipids and minerals, in particular calcium. And then we have cartilage, which is more rubbery, and we have 3 different types of that. The first one is hyaline, and I'm going to put a little star next to that one because that one is our most common form of cartilage in the body. So it's the most common, and it forms most of the embryonic skeleton. It's also going to be found at the ends of long bones, and that's because it's left over from those original little cartilage bones in the fetus. And then we have elastic cartilage, which is very kind of rubber bandy, which makes sense. And that's going to be found in your ear and the epiglottis, which is that little flap that covers up your larynx so that you don't aspirate food or liquid. And the last type is fibrocartilage, which is going to be found in places that really deal with a lot of impact, like intervertebral discs and in your knees. So that's just really boiling down some of the essentials of connective tissue. There are some terms that were on the other half of that page, and you should be able to find definitions for all of those pretty easily by using the search function in your textbook. Now let's take a look at a few slides. So we've already gone over this. These tissues are going to bind things, but they're also going to support and provide protection because you've got blood cells which give you immunity. So really, if you've got a type of tissue that has a whole bunch of different types of functions, you're probably talking about connective tissue. Generally has a pretty decent blood supply with a few exceptions. So ligaments and tendons, because they're ropes that are constantly being pulled, generally are avascular, which means they have a very tough time healing. If you ask pretty much any athlete whether they would rather tear a ligament or a muscle, they would most likely tell you muscle. So we have the different types of fibers that he talked about in the other video. You've got collagen, which is fairly tough. It actually makes up a good portion of bone. You've got elastic, which is like an elastic rubber band, so it's very stretchy. And then you have reticular fibers, which are very delicate. So you kind of think of that almost like a little spider web network that's fairly easy to break up, but can give us a little bit of a framework to some of the organs. There are lots of different specialty types of cells that we find in connective tissue. Fibroblasts are going to secrete fibers, and that's going to give us a lot of kind of stringiness to some of those extracellular matrices. Macrophages are going to engulf foreign substances, so that'll help to kind of wander around and engulf things that shouldn't be there, so they defend us. Mast cells stimulate inflammation by releasing histamine, and they can also cause a decrease in blood clotting because of a release of heparin. So your mast cells might get overactive this time of year like mine do, and then you get histamines being released, which makes you be kind of inflamed in your nasal passages and you feel congested. So we already went over those, so we'll jump past that. We've got our different tissue types. Let's take a look at some pictures here. So areolar connective tissue has lots of fibers running through it, so all the little stringy things. Adipose tends to look like big bubbles. What makes this look different than the simple squamous bubbles that we kind of see in the lungs are that if you notice here, you have fairly smooth bubbles, and then you might see one little nucleus. So this is all filled with fat. But in the alveoli, you get a very kind of uneven bubble formed because you have lots of these little simple squamous cells making it up, and then this is filled with air. So my surface tends to be uneven, and I tend to see a lot of nuclei for all those different cells. Reticular connective tissue, again, also has a fair number of fibers. When you're studying some of the slides and being able to identify these different tissues, don't look at the colors, because the colors are just whatever the scientists decided to use when they stained them for the slide. So you can't guarantee that areolar tissue, for example, looks pink. That's just a dye that they used or a stain that they used. Dense connective tissue, the ropes in our body, tend to look very stringy because we have lots and lots of fibers making them very tough. It can be a little difficult to distinguish between these different types. Don't worry, I'm going to tend to pick histology pictures that are pretty distinct in what they look like. Hyaline cartilage looks a lot like that grandma's jello, right? Where you've got lots of matrix, the gelatin, and then your little marshmallow cells kind of embedded in it. Whereas elastic and fibrocartilage have those same bubbles, but lots and lots of fibers now mixed in because these are tougher than the hyaline cartilage. Bone has a very distinct look to it. It looks like you took a tree and cut it in half, and you can see the rings of the tree. Blood has a very distinct look to it as well. Each of these little kind of pink discs here, these are red blood cells. The large ones are white blood cells. And then you see little pieces of cells, and those are the platelets that help you with clotting. All right, so that's it for connective tissue for now. I will post some other slides up online for you to take a look at. And then we'll move on to the integumentary system.